An eagle handed its baby to a man and started crying. The scene caught on camera looked impossible, but what that guy did next left everyone in shock. Watch till the end. The ending will give you goosebumps. Subscribe to the channel for stories that sound unreal but are 100% true. The Montana sky blazed with golden hues as Ethan Miller sat alone at the edge of the vast woodland that bordered his isolated cabin. At 42, he had chosen this remote corner of Big Sky country to escape the noise and complications of his former life in Seattle. 3 years had passed since he'd walked away from his architectural firm, his marriage, and the constant reminders of what he'd lost. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine and wild sage as Ethan watched the sunset from his favorite spot on a weather-worn bench. He had built it himself during his first month here, one of many projects to keep his hands busy while his mind wrestled with the past. His routine was simple now: wake up, tend to his small vegetable garden, chop wood, read books he'd been meaning to get to for years, and mostly be alone with his thoughts. The sudden shadow passing overhead made him look up just as a majestic bald eagle swooped down in a graceful dive. Ethan remained perfectly still, mesmerized by the bird's presence. It was not uncommon to see eagles in this part of Montana, but he had never witnessed one approach a human so boldly. The eagle landed barely 10 feet away, its powerful wings causing a small dust cloud to rise from the dry ground. Clutched in its talons was a small, fragile eaglet with sparse feathers and frightened eyes. Ethan didn't move, unsure of what was happening. The mother eagle tilted her head, studying him with intense amber eyes that seemed to hold intelligence beyond that of a mere bird. Then she opened her beak and released a prolonged sound, a hoarse, anguished lament that echoed across the valley. The cry sent shivers down Ethan's spine. Before he could process what was happening, the eagle gently deposited the small eaglet at his feet and with powerful wing strokes launched back into the air. "What the hell?" Ethan whispered, watching. The adult eagle's silhouette grew smaller against the darkening sky. At his feet, the baby eagle chirped weakly, its small body trembling. Ethan knelt down, carefully examining the creature. It didn't appear to be injured, just frightened and vulnerable. Something about its eyes drew him in. They held an unusual intelligence, a presence that felt almost familiar. "Hey there, little one," he said softly. "What am I supposed to do with you?" The eaglet chirped again, a pitiful sound that stirred something deep within Ethan's chest, a protective instinct he thought had been buried years ago, along with his dreams of fatherhood. "I can't just leave you out here," he murmured, making a decision that would alter the course of his solitary existence. With gentle hands, he scooped up the small bird, cradling it against his chest as he walked back to his cabin. Inside, he quickly improvised a nest using an old wicker basket and some soft flannel shirts he never wore anymore. He placed it near the wood stove, where the eaglet would stay warm through the night. "You need a name," Ethan said, watching as the small bird settled into its makeshift home. "How about Phoenix? Seems fitting." That night, Ethan hardly slept. He kept getting up to check on Phoenix, worried about the eaglet's survival. By morning, he was relieved to find the bird still alive, chirping hungrily. After a quick internet search on his spotty satellite connection, Ethan prepared a mixture of raw meat cut into tiny pieces that the eaglet eagerly consumed. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Ethan carried Phoenix outside, curious if the mother eagle would return. Sure enough, as the morning light bathed the landscape, a distinct silhouette appeared against the blue canvas. The eagle perched on a tall boulder that overlooked Ethan's property, observing from a distance. "She's watching us," Ethan said to Phoenix, who seemed to recognize his mother chirping excitedly. "But why leave you with me?" Over the next few days, a strange routine developed. Ethan cared for Phoenix, constructing a better shelter with branches and soft materials. He researched eagle development and behavior, becoming increasingly invested in the eaglet's well-being. Each morning, the mother eagle would appear, always on the same boulder, watching silently before disappearing again until the following day. "She trusts me with you," Ethan realized aloud one morning, speaking to Phoenix as he had begun to do regularly. "Or she has no choice. Is she hurt? Is that why she can't care for you herself?" Phoenix was growing rapidly, his sparse feathers giving way to stronger plumage, his talons becoming sharper. Ethan began documenting the eaglet's progress in a journal, measuring his wingspan and weight, noting behavioral changes. It gave him purpose, a focus he hadn't felt in years. 2 weeks into this unexpected arrangement, Ethan received a rare visitor. The sound of tires on the gravel driveway pulled him from his task of preparing Phoenix's meal. He stepped onto the porch, squinting at the approaching vehicle. "Damn it," he muttered, recognizing his brother's blue pickup truck. Jake Miller killed the engine and stepped out, his 6-foot frame unfolding from the driver's seat. Unlike Ethan's lean build and untrimmed beard, Jake was clean-shaven, with the solid physique of someone who spent his days working outdoors as a national park ranger. "You look like hell," Jake called out by way of greeting, grabbing a 6-pack from the passenger seat. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, not bothering to hide his annoyance at the interruption. "Sarah's worried about you. You haven't answered her calls in weeks." Ethan sighed. Sarah, his ex-wife, maintained a friendship with Jake and his wife, despite the divorce. "I'm fine. Reception's bad up here." "That's bullshit and you know it," Jake replied, climbing the steps to the porch. He paused, noticing the unusual setup in the corner. "What's that?" Before Ethan could stop him, Jake moved closer to the sheltered area where Phoenix was resting. The eaglet, now much more alert and aware, raised his head at the stranger's approach. "Is that a damn bald eagle?" Jake's voice rose in disbelief. "Ethan, do you have any idea how illegal this is? You could face federal charges for keeping a protected species." "I'm not keeping him," Ethan said defensively. "His mother brought him to me. I think she's injured." Jake's expression shifted from shock to concern. "What do you mean, brought him to you?" Ethan explained what had happened that evening at sunset, describing the mother eagle's behavior and her daily visits. As he spoke, he realized how unbelievable it sounded, a wild eagle entrusting her offspring to a human. "You know how crazy this sounds, right?" Jake said when Ethan finished. "I know what I saw, Jake. Something's wrong with her. She can't care for him properly, but she's still watching over him." Jake ran a hand through his short hair, his ranger training kicking in. "You should have called Wildlife Services immediately. This bird needs professional care." "No," Ethan said firmly. "They'll take him away, put him in some rehabilitation center. The mother chose me for a reason." "You sound insane right now," Jake said, his voice softening. "Is this about Michael? Are you projecting something onto this bird because—" "Don't." Ethan cut him off sharply. "This has nothing to do with that." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Jake sighed and placed the 6-pack on the porch railing. "Look, I get that you're isolated up here, and maybe helping this eaglet gives you purpose, but you need to consider what's best for the bird." "I am," Ethan insisted. "Phoenix is thriving under my care." "Phoenix?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "You named it?" "Him. I named him." Jake looked at his brother with a mixture of concern and resignation. "I'll give you 1 week to figure this out properly, or I'm calling in Wildlife Services myself. That's the best I can do." After Jake left, Ethan sat beside Phoenix's enclosure, anxiety churning in his stomach. "Looks like we're on borrowed time, little guy," he whispered. That night, a powerful storm rolled through the mountains. Lightning illuminated the cabin in brilliant flashes, and thunder shook the windows. Phoenix became agitated, screeching in distress. Ethan moved the eaglet's nest closer to his bed, trying to calm him with soft words. "It's okay," he soothed. "I'm right here." As another crack of thunder boomed overhead, Ethan found himself telling Phoenix about Michael, his son who had never had the chance to grow up. The words poured out of him after years of silence, spoken in hushed tones as the storm raged outside. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Ethan wept openly, the eaglet watching him with those strangely knowing eyes. Morning brought clarity with the fresh, rain-washed air. Ethan stood on his porch, Phoenix perched on his arm, both looking toward the boulder where the mother eagle usually appeared. But today, the rock stood empty against the backdrop of pine-covered mountains. Where is she? Ethan wondered aloud, a sense of unease growing within him. The next day, she didn't appear either, or the day after that. With each passing morning of her absence, Ethan's concern deepened. Had something happened to her? Had she finally abandoned her offspring completely? Phoenix seemed to sense the change as well, growing restless in his enclosure, looking skyward more frequently. Ethan noticed another worrying development. Despite Phoenix's growth and strengthening wings, the eaglet made no attempt to fly. When Ethan placed him on low branches to encourage him, Phoenix would flap his wings briefly before giving up, as if some invisible barrier prevented him from embracing his true nature. "What are you afraid of?" Ethan asked one afternoon, holding the eaglet at eye level. "Flying is what you were born to do." 1 week after Jake's visit, Ethan's satellite phone rang. He knew who it was before answering. "Time's up," Jake said without preamble. "What's your plan?" Ethan looked at Phoenix, who was attempting to balance on the porch railing, wings spread but not quite committing to flight. "I need more time," Ethan replied. "The mother hasn't returned, and he still can't fly." "Ethan, be reasonable," Jake's voice crackled through the phone. "You can't keep living in this fantasy where you're some kind of eagle whisperer." Ethan watched Phoenix, attempting to balance on the railing, his powerful wings now fully formed, but somehow unused. 2 more weeks, he negotiated. "If he's not flying by, then I'll call Wildlife Services myself." After a long pause, Jake reluctantly agreed. 2 weeks, not a day more. "And Ethan, take care of yourself too, not just the bird." The call ended, leaving Ethan with a tight deadline and a growing sense of responsibility. That afternoon, he began constructing a larger enclosure that would give Phoenix more room to practice flying. As he worked, hammering wood and securing wire mesh, a memory surfaced, one he had buried deep within the recesses of his mind. 5 years ago, he had been building a treehouse for Michael, planning to surprise him on his 8th birthday. The wooden structure remained unfinished, abandoned in their Seattle backyard, like everything else in their life after the accident. Sarah had begged him to complete it, to honor Michael's memory, but Ethan couldn't bear to look at it, much less work on it. Their grief had taken different paths, hers toward preservation of memories, his toward escape from them. "I ran away," Ethan admitted aloud, the realization striking him as he secured the last panel of Phoenix's expanded home. "Just like you're afraid to fly." That evening, as the Montana sky painted itself in watercolor hues of pink and orange, Ethan sat on his porch steps with Phoenix perched beside him. The eaglet had grown comfortable with human contact, too comfortable perhaps for a wild creature. "You need to remember who you are," Ethan told him. "You're meant for the sky, not for life, with an old hermit like me." The next morning, Ethan began a more aggressive approach to flight training. He researched eagle parenting behaviors and learned that adult eagles often pushed their young from the nest to force them to fly. While he couldn't bring himself to be quite so harsh, he did start placing Phoenix on higher perches, gradually increasing the height each day. "Come on, Phoenix," Ethan encouraged, standing a few feet away with arms outstretched. "You can do this." The eaglet would flap his wings vigorously, but always retreated from the edge at the last moment, chirping anxiously. Something was holding him back. A fear or hesitation that Ethan couldn't quite understand, but somehow recognized in himself. On D. The fifth day of flight training, while Ethan was preparing lunch, a sharp knock at his door startled him. He wasn't expecting Jake for another 9 days, and no one else ever visited his remote cabin. Opening the door, he found himself face to face with a woman in her mid-30s, wearing a khaki uniform with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service emblem on the shoulder. "Mr. Miller," she asked, her expression professional but not unfriendly. "I'm Dr. Alicia Harper, wildlife biologist. I understand you're in possession of a juvenile bald eagle." Ethan's heart sank. Jake had betrayed their agreement. "Who told you that?" "We received an anonymous tip," she replied, though her slight hesitation suggested otherwise. "May I come in? I just want to assess the situation." Reluctantly, Ethan stepped aside. Dr. Harper entered, her observant eyes quickly scanning the cabin until they landed on Phoenix's enclosure by the window. The eaglet watched her cautiously from his perch. "He looks healthy," she commented. "Approaching slowly. You've been taking good care of him." "His mother brought him to me," Ethan explained defensively. "I didn't take him from the wild." Dr. Harper gave him a skeptical look. "Eagles don't typically entrust their young to humans, Mr. Miller." "This one did," Ethan insisted, recounting the story again. As he spoke, he realized how many times he'd replayed that sunset moment in his mind, how it had become a pivot point in his existence. To his surprise, Dr. Harper didn't immediately dismiss his account. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions about the mother eagle's behavior, Phoenix's development, and the daily observations you've been keeping. "Records?" she asked, noticing the journal on his desk. Ethan nodded and handed her the notebook filled with his meticulous notes. Dr. Harper flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from professional detachment to genuine interest. "These are incredibly detailed observations," she said. "You've documented his development with scientific precision." "I wanted to understand him," Ethan replied simply. Dr. Harper continued examining Phoenix from a respectful distance. "You said he's not attempting to fly. At his age and development." "Stage? That's unusual. Has he sustained any injuries to his wings?" "None that I can see. He extends them fully, flaps them, but won't launch himself into the air. It's like he's afraid, or like he doesn't know he's supposed to," Dr. Harper suggested. "Eagles learn to fly partly through instinct, but also by watching their parents. If he was separated from his mother too early, he might not have those visual cues." Ethan hadn't considered this. "So what do we do?" The use of "we" wasn't lost on Dr. Harper, who smiled slightly. "First, I need to examine him properly, make sure there are no physical issues preventing flight." After a thorough examination, during which Phoenix remained surprisingly calm, Dr. Harper confirmed there were no physical impediments to flight. "He's perfectly capable from a physiological standpoint. The issue is behavioral or psychological." "Can that be fixed?" Ethan asked. "Possibly," she replied. "There are rehabilitation centers that specialize in preparing juvenile eagles for release back into the wild. They use various techniques, including surrogate parent eagles and controlled flying environments." The thought of Phoenix being taken away made Ethan's chest tighten. "And if he stays here?" Dr. Harper sighed. "Mr. Miller, Ethan, please." "Ethan keeping a bald eagle without proper permits is a federal offense. Even with the unusual circumstances you've described, I'm obligated to relocate him to a licensed facility." "What if I could get him to fly before you take him?" Ethan asked, a desperate edge to his voice. "What if I could prove he's ready to return to the wild?" Dr. Harper studied him, seeming to weigh professional protocol against the unusual situation before her. "That would certainly change things," she finally said, "but I can't give you unlimited time." "How long?" "I can give you 1 week, and that's pushing my professional boundaries to the limit." If he's not flying by then, I'll have to take him to the rehabilitation center, and I'll need to check in regularly to monitor his progress. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than having Phoenix taken away immediately. Deal, Ethan agreed. After Dr. Harper left, promising to return in 2 days, Ethan sat beside Phoenix's enclosure. Looks like we're really on the clock now, buddy. We've got to get you airborne. The next morning, Ethan woke with renewed determination. He carried Phoenix outside to a clearing near the edge of the forest, where the terrain sloped gently downward, creating a natural runway of sorts. Today's the day, he told the eaglet, who seemed to sense the shift in Ethan's energy, perching alertly on his arm. For hours, Ethan worked with Phoenix, positioning him on increasingly higher perches, creating air disturbances beneath his wings to stimulate flight responses, even running with the bird to generate momentum. Nothing worked. By late afternoon, both were exhausted and frustrated. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the clearing, Ethan sat on a rock, Phoenix beside him. "What am I missing?" he wondered aloud. "What would your mother do?" The mention of Phoenix's mother triggered something in Ethan's mind, a memory of that first day, the adult eagle's anguished cry before she left her offspring in his care. There had been something in that sound, a desperation he recognized, because he had felt it himself. She was asking for help, Ethan realized. She knew she couldn't teach you herself, so she found someone who could. But why him? Of all the people in these mountains, why had she chosen a broken architect hiding from his past? That night, Ethan dreamed of Michael. They were standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind whipping around them. Michael was smiling, fearless as always, his small hand clasped tightly in Ethan's. "You have to let go, Dad," Dream Michael said, his voice older and wiser than his years. "You have to let go so I can fly." Ethan woke with tears streaming down his face and a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He understood now what he needed to do. The next day, Dr. Harper returned as promised. She found Ethan packing a small backpack with water and food. "What's the plan?" she asked, noting his determined expression. "We're going to the highest cliff in the region," Ethan replied, securing Phoenix in a specially designed carrier. If gentle encouragement won't work, maybe he needs a more dramatic push. Dr. Harper's eyes widened. "You're not thinking of throwing him off a cliff?" "Not exactly," Ethan said, shouldering his pack. "But sometimes the only way to overcome fear is to face it head on. Are you coming?" After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "I'll drive." The journey to Eagle's Point, a dramatic cliff face that rose nearly 1,000 feet above the valley floor, took them through winding mountain roads and finally a steep hiking trail. Ethan carried Phoenix the entire way, speaking to him softly, preparing him for what was to come. When they reached the summit, the view was spectacular, miles of untamed wilderness stretching to the horizon, the afternoon sun casting a golden glow over everything. "A perfect place for a first flight." "This is crazy," Dr. Harper said, standing well back from the edge. "If he doesn't fly, he'll fall to his death." "He'll fly," Ethan said with a conviction that surprised even him. "He's ready. He just needs to remember who he is." Carefully, he removed Phoenix from the carrier and held him at eye level. "Time to be what you were born to be," he whispered. Dr. Harper watched anxiously as Ethan approached the cliff edge with Phoenix perched on his arm. The eaglet seemed nervous, sensing the height and the vast open space before him. His wings opened and closed reflexively, as if testing the air. "Ethan, maybe we should reconsider," Dr. Harper called. "Start with something lower. Work our way up to this." But Ethan wasn't listening. He was remembering his dream, Michael's words echoing in his mind. "You have to let go so I can fly." Taking a deep breath, Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, He lifted his arm higher and, with a silent prayer, launched Phoenix into the open air. Time seemed to slow as the eaglet left the safety of Ethan's arm. For one terrifying moment, Phoenix plummeted, his wings flapping uncoordinatedly, unable to catch the air properly. Ethan's heart stopped, the horror of what he'd done crashing over him. "No!" Ethan cried out, lunging forward, as if he could somehow reach Phoenix, though the bird was already beyond his grasp. Dr. Harper grabbed his arm, pulling him back from the edge. Then, something extraordinary happened. A shadow crossed the sun, and a familiar silhouette appeared, the mother eagle, her wingspan magnificent against the bright sky. She had been gone for days, but somehow she had found them. Her feathers were ragged, one wing noticeably damaged, but she flew with fierce determination. With incredible precision, she positioned herself beneath her falling offspring, not touching him, but creating an updraft with her powerful wings. The effect was immediate. Phoenix's instincts awakened at the presence of his mother. His wings extended fully, catching the air current she had created. His descent slowed, then stopped altogether as he began to glide, wobbly at first, then with increasing confidence. "My God," Dr. Harper whispered, her scientific detachment momentarily forgotten. "It's just like you said. She brought him to you because she was injured. She couldn't teach him herself." Ethan couldn't speak, overcome with emotion as he watched the two eagles soar together. Phoenix's movements became more coordinated with each passing minute, mimicking his mother's technique despite her injured wing. They circled the cliff face, rising higher on thermal currents, a perfect dance of nature unfolding before human eyes. "She waited," Ethan finally said, his voice thick. She knew he would need her for this moment. They watched until the eagles were mere specks against the vast Montana sky, then disappeared altogether beyond the distant mountains. A profound sense of loss and accomplishment washed over Ethan. He had succeeded in helping Phoenix find his wings, but now the eaglet was gone, returned to the wild where he belonged. The drive back to Ethan's cabin was quiet. Both he and Dr. Harper lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. "What will you put in your official report?" Ethan finally asked as they pulled up to his cabin. Dr. Harper turned off the engine and faced him. That a juvenile bald eagle was successfully rehabilitated and returned to its natural habitat under supervised conditions, she said with a small smile. The details might be a bit vague. "Thank you," Ethan said simply. "No," she replied. "Thank you for showing me something I never would have believed if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." She paused, then added more softly, "And I'm sorry about your son." Ethan stiffened. "How did you know about Michael?" "Your brother mentioned it when he called me," she admitted. "He was worried about you, thought you might be using the eagle as some kind of emotional substitute." The revelation that Jake had reached out to Dr. Harper directly should have angered him, but Ethan found he didn't have the energy for anger anymore. Too much had happened. Too much had changed. Was he right? Dr. Harper asked gently. Ethan looked toward the mountains where Phoenix had disappeared. "Maybe at first," he acknowledged, "but in the end, I think Phoenix helped me more than I helped him." That night, alone in his cabin, Ethan felt an emptiness he hadn't expected. He had grown accustomed to Phoenix's presence, the routine of caring for him, the purpose it had given his days. Now, that was gone, and he was left to face the silence and his memories once more. Unable to sleep, he sat on his porch under a canopy of stars, thinking about Michael, about Sarah, about the life he had run from. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to fully remember his son, not just the tragedy that took him, but the joy he had brought to their lives. The sound of his laughter, the way he asked endless questions about how things worked, his fearlessness in climbing trees and jumping into lakes. "You would have loved Phoenix," Ethan said aloud, as if Michael could hear him across the divide that separated them. "You always wanted a pet eagle after watching that nature documentary." A shooting star streaked across the night sky, and Ethan smiled sadly. As a child, Michael had believed that shooting stars were messages from people who had gone before. "Look, Dad," he would exclaim whenever they spotted one. "Someone's saying hello." The following morning, Ethan woke with a decision formed in his mind. He packed a small suitcase, closed up the cabin, and drove to the nearest town with cell service. There he made 2 calls, one to Jake, the other to Sarah. His conversation with Jake was brief but meaningful, an acknowledgement of his brother's concern and a sincere thank you for sending Dr. Harper instead of wildlife officials, who might have simply confiscated Phoenix. Jake was surprised by Ethan's lack of resentment, but welcomed the change in his brother's tone. The call to Sarah was harder. They hadn't spoken in over a year, their last conversation ending in painful silence neither knew how to break. "Ethan," her voice was cautious, as if she couldn't quite believe it was him. "Hi, Sarah," he replied, suddenly uncertain what to say next. How could he explain what had happened with Phoenix, how caring for the eaglet had begun to heal something within him he thought would remain broken forever? "Are you okay?" she asked, concern evident in her tone. "I'm coming home," he said simply. "Not permanently, but I think it's time I finished Michael's treehouse." The silence on the other end stretched for several heartbeats. Then he heard a soft sob. "I'd like that," she finally managed. "It's still there, just waiting." 2 days later, Ethan stood in the backyard of what had once been his family home, staring up at the half-finished treehouse nestled in the branches of an old oak tree. Sarah watched from the kitchen window, giving him space for this moment. The wooden structure was weathered but sound, the foundation he had built 5 years ago strong enough to support the completion of his son's dream. Ethan ran his hand along the rough planks, remembering Michael's excitement when they had first discussed the project. "Can it have a lookout tower, Dad, so I can see all the way to the mountains?" "Of course it can, buddy. We'll build the best lookout tower in Seattle." Ethan climbed the ladder to the platform, taking stock of what needed to be done. He had brought his tools from Montana, determined to finish what he had started before grief had consumed him. As he worked, measuring and cutting, the familiar rhythm of construction brought both comfort and a bittersweet ache. This was what he had been trained to do: build things, create spaces, leave something lasting in a world full of impermanence. Sarah brought him lunch, setting it quietly on a corner of the platform before retreating. They had agreed to take things slowly, to rebuild their connection one careful step at a time, just as Ethan was rebuilding the treehouse. By late afternoon, he had made significant progress, adding walls and beginning the framework for the lookout tower Michael had wanted. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Ethan paused, wiping sweat from his brow. Something made him look up, scanning the sky almost unconsciously. There, circling high above the neighborhood, was a bald eagle, an unusual sight in suburban Seattle. Ethan's heart raced as he watched the bird's graceful movements. It was impossible to tell from this distance if it was Phoenix, grown now into a mature eagle, or just a random bird that happened to pass overhead. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The eagle was a reminder, a symbol of what he had learned in the Montana wilderness. Over the next week, Ethan threw himself into completing the treehouse, working from sunrise to sunset. Sarah would join him sometimes, handing him tools or holding boards in place. Their teamwork tentative at first, then more comfortable as the days passed. They spoke about Michael, sharing memories they had each held privately for too long. There were tears, but there was also laughter, something Ethan hadn't thought possible when remembering his son. Dr. Harper called once, checking in on him and sharing the news that she had spotted the mother eagle and what she believed was Phoenix, thriving in their natural habitat near Eagle's Point. Ethan listened, grateful for the update, but also aware that his connection to the eagles was now part of his past, a chapter that had served its purpose in his healing journey. On the final day of construction, Ethan added the last touches to the lookout tower. A small telescope, mounted on a swivel base, pointed toward the distant Cascade Mountains. He would have loved this, Sarah said, standing beside him on the platform that now supported a fully realized treehouse, complete with walls, windows, a roof, and even a small deck. Yeah, Ethan agreed, his throat tight with emotion. He would have. As they stood there together, not touching but closer than they had been in years, a familiar cry echoed from above. Both looked up to see an eagle soaring overhead, its wingspan impressive against the cloud-scattered sky. "Is that—" Sarah began, aware of the story Ethan had shared with her. "I don't know," he replied honestly, "but I'd like to think so." That evening, as twilight settled over Seattle, Ethan sat alone in the completed treehouse, a small lantern casting warm light around the space. He had brought something with him from Montana, the journal in which he had documented Phoenix's development. Opening it to a blank page near the end, he began to write, "Michael, I built this treehouse for you just like I promised. It took me longer than it should have, and for that, I'm sorry. Grief made me forget who I was, made me run from the pain instead of facing it. But a strange thing happened in Montana. Something that helped me remember what you always knew, that even when things seem darkest, there's always hope if you're brave enough to spread your wings. A mother eagle brought her baby to me, trusted me to help him learn to fly when she couldn't teach him herself. At first, I thought I was saving him, but the truth is he saved me. He reminded me that life goes on, that growth and change are possible even after the deepest loss. I don't know if you can see this treehouse from wherever you are, but I hope you know it was built with all the love I have, and I hope you know that while I'll always miss you, I'm finally learning to fly again myself. Love always, Dad." Ethan closed the journal, wiped away tears, and looked out through the window of the lookout tower. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and as he watched, a shooting star blazed briefly across the heavens. "Someone's saying hello," Ethan whispered, echoing what Michael would have said. He spent the night in the treehouse, wrapped in a sleeping bag, watching the stars through the skylight he had installed in the roof. It wasn't planned. He had meant to return to the guest room in Sarah's house, but something about being in this space, surrounded by the physical manifestation of his healing, felt right. Morning brought the chirping of birds and dappled sunlight through the oak leaves. Ethan awoke feeling more rested than he had in years. For a moment, he could almost imagine Michael climbing up the ladder, eager to explore his completed tree house. A gentle knock on the wooden floor made him sit up. Sarah's head appeared through the entrance, her expression tentative. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. Ethan gestured to the space beside him. "It's your yard, your treehouse too." Sarah climbed up and settled beside him, looking around at the craftsmanship, the care that had gone into every detail. "It's better than we originally planned," she said softly. "I had a lot of time to think about the design," Ethan replied. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the morning light shift through the leaves. "What happens now?" Sarah finally asked, the question encompassing more than just the immediate future. Ethan considered this. The past 2 weeks had been focused solely on completing the treehouse, a finite goal with a clear endpoint. Beyond that, he hadn't allowed himself to plan. "I don't know," he admitted. "I can't just go back to Montana and pretend none of this happened. And I can't ask you to stay here if it's going to reopen old wounds," Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the emotion behind her words. Before Ethan could respond, his phone rang. It was Dr. Harper calling from Montana. He hesitated, then answered, putting the call on speaker so Sarah could hear. "Ethan, I'm at your cabin," Dr. Harper said without preamble. "You need to come back. There's something you should see." "What is it?" Ethan asked, puzzled by the urgency in her voice. "The eagles are back. Both of them, the mother and Phoenix. They've built a nest in the tall pine near your porch, and I think they're waiting for you." Sarah looked at Ethan, seeing the conflict in his eyes. "Go," she said. "You need to see this through." 48 hours later, Ethan's truck pulled up to his Montana cabin. Dr. Harper was waiting on the porch, binoculars in hand. She looked different, more relaxed in jeans and a flannel shirt instead of her official uniform. "They're still here," she said by way of greeting, pointing toward a massive pine tree at the edge of his property. "I've been monitoring them. The mother's wing has healed remarkably well, though she still favors it slightly." Ethan followed her gaze and saw the unmistakable shape of an eagle's nest high in the branches. As if on cue, a large form emerged from the nest and took flight, circling once before perching on a nearby branch. "Phoenix?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think so," Dr. Harper nodded. "He's grown, but the marking pattern on his wings matches your documentation. And look at this." She handed Ethan her tablet, showing photographs she had taken over the past 2 days. The images showed not just the 2 eagles, but something else, a third, smaller form in the nest. "Is that—" Ethan couldn't finish the sentence. "This implication too extraordinary." "An eaglet," Dr. Harper confirmed. "They've returned to have their young near your cabin. I've never seen anything like it in 20 years of wildlife biology." Over the next few days, Ethan observed the eagle family from a respectful distance, documenting their behavior just as he had done with Phoenix. The mother eagle seemed fully recovered, capable of hunting and caring for her offspring. Phoenix, now a magnificent adult, shared in the parenting duties, bringing food to the nest and standing guard while his mate tended to their young. Dr. Harper visited daily, her professional interest evolving into something more personal. She had applied for a research grant to study this unusual eagle family, particularly the apparent bond they had formed with a human habitat. "This could change how we understand eagle behavior," she explained excitedly one evening as they shared dinner on Ethan's porch. "The fact that they chose to return to your property, to raise their young in proximity to a human dwelling, it challenges everything we know about these typically solitary, human-averse creatures." Ethan listened, appreciating her enthusiasm, but feeling something else, a sense of purpose he had been missing for years. "I was thinking of turning this place into a sanctuary," he said suddenly. "Not just for eagles, but for all kinds of injured wildlife. There's enough land, and with my architecture background, I could design appropriate habitats." "That's actually a brilliant idea," Dr. Harper, Alicia, as she had asked him to call her, replied. "But what about your life in Seattle? Your ex-wife seemed important to you." "Sarah will always be important to me," Ethan acknowledged. "We share a history, a loss that no one else can understand. But we're different people now. Our paths diverged a long time ago." He didn't mention the conversation they'd had before he left Seattle, the mutual recognition that while healing together had been necessary, moving forward might mean different directions for each of them. Sarah had finally started dating again, a kind literature professor at the university. Ethan had given her his blessing, and in turn, she had encouraged him to find his own path to happiness. "Besides," he added with a small smile, "Seattle has enough architects. Montana could use a wildlife sanctuary designed by someone who understands both the animals and the environment." As summer turned to fall, Ethan's vision began taking shape. With Alicia's expertise and connections in the wildlife community, He secured preliminary permits and funding to convert his property into a small-scale rehabilitation center. His architectural firm in Seattle, intrigued by the unique project, agreed to provide remote consulting services, allowing him to work part-time while focusing on the sanctuary. The Eagle family remained throughout this transformation, seemingly unperturbed by the construction activity as long as a respectful distance was maintained from their nest. Their eaglet grew rapidly, its first attempts at flight remarkably similar to what Phoenix had experienced. The same hesitation, the same need for parental guidance. One crisp October morning, as Ethan and Alicia were reviewing plans for a new rehabilitation enclosure, they heard a commotion from the direction of the eagle nest. Looking up, they saw the young eaglet perched precariously on the edge, wings spread, but trembling with uncertainty. "It's time," Alicia whispered, raising her binoculars. "The first flight." They watched as the mother eagle and Phoenix circled near their offspring, calling encouragement. The young bird shuffled back and forth, clearly torn between fear and instinct. "Come on, little one," Ethan murmured. "Remember who you are." As if hearing him, the eaglet looked directly toward the humans watching from below. Then, with a leap of faith, it launched itself into the open air. For one heart-stopping moment it plummeted, just as Phoenix had done, but almost immediately its wings caught the wind, and it began to soar, awkwardly at first, then with increasing confidence. Phoenix and his mate flanked their offspring, guiding it through its inaugural flight. The three eagles circled the property once, twice, then a third time, before the young one landed somewhat clumsily on a branch not far from the nest, chattering excitedly at its accomplishment. "They did it," Alicia said, gripping Ethan's arm. "They taught their young to fly all on their own this time." "Full circle," Ethan nodded, a profound sense of completion washing over him. That evening, as twilight painted the Montana sky in shades of purple and gold, Ethan sat alone on his porch, contemplating how much his life had changed in the span of a single year. From a man hiding from his past, he had become someone with a future, with purpose, with connections both human and wild. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, who had been following the progress of the sanctuary through their regular conversations. "Michael would be so proud of what you're building." Ethan smiled, knowing she was right. His son had always loved animals, had always been the first to rescue an injured bird or a stranded turtle. In a way, this sanctuary was as much for Michael as the treehouse had been. Different manifestations of the same love, the same desire to honor his memory by creating something meaningful. As if in response to this thought, the mother eagle appeared, swooping low over the cabin before landing on the very same boulder where she had watched over Phoenix during those first uncertain days. She regarded Ethan with those penetrating amber eyes, then turned her gaze to the mountains beyond, to the vast wilderness that was her true home. "Thank you," Ethan said simply, knowing she couldn't understand his words, but hoping somehow she sensed his gratitude. "For trusting me, for showing me the way back." The eagle mantled her wings once, majestically, then took flight again, disappearing into the gathering dusk. But Ethan knew she would return, as would Phoenix and their offspring. They had formed a connection that transcended the usual boundaries between human and wild, a rare bridge between worlds that had healed them all. 6 months later, the Eagles Wing Wildlife Sanctuary officially opened its doors. What had begun as a personal project had grown into a community effort, with local schools involved in educational programs and volunteers helping to care for the rehabilitating animals. Ethan's architectural designs had received recognition in environmental publications, praised for their innovative approach to creating spaces that served both the animals' needs and conservation goals. Alicia had accepted a position as the sanctuary's resident biologist, her research on the eagle family's unusual behavior gaining attention in scientific circles. She and Ethan had developed a partnership that extended beyond professional collaboration, a slow-blooming relationship built on shared passion and mutual respect. Sarah visited for the opening ceremony, bringing with her a gift, a small model of the treehouse, perfectly recreated in miniature, to be displayed in the sanctuary's visitor center. A reminder, she said, of where it all began. As the seasons turned again, new animals came to the sanctuary, injured wolves, orphaned bear cubs, hawks with broken wings, each finding temporary refuge while they healed enough to return to the wild. Not all could be released, and some became permanent residents, ambassadors for their species in the educational programs. But the eagles remained special, their story interwoven with Ethan's own journey from brokenness to wholeness. Their nest became something of a local legend, with birdwatchers traveling miles to catch a glimpse of the family that had chosen to make their home near humans. On the anniversary of Phoenix's first flight, Ethan hiked alone to Eagle's Point, the cliff where everything had changed. The view was just as spectacular as he remembered, miles of untamed wilderness stretching to the horizon, a reminder of the smallness of human concerns in the grand scheme of nature. As he stood there, feeling the wind on his face, a shadow passed. Overhead, looking up, he saw not one eagle but three, Phoenix, his mate, and their now fully grown offspring, soaring effortlessly on thermal currents. They circled above him once, a silent acknowledgement, before continuing their journey across the vast Montana sky. Ethan watched until they disappeared from sight, his heart full. He had come to understand that some bonds transcend explanation, that sometimes the most profound healing comes from the most unexpected connections. In saving Phoenix, he had saved himself. In learning to let go, he had found a new way to hold on to what mattered most. The sun was setting as he made his way back down the mountain, casting the landscape in golden light, reminiscent of that fateful evening when an eagle had entrusted her child to a broken man. Both had been wounded then, both uncertain of the future. Now both soared in their own ways, forever changed by the brief time their paths had crossed. And somewhere above, riding the invisible currents of the endless sky, eagles flew free, a living testament to the power of trust, resilience, and the courage to spread one's wings, even in the face of fear. Beloved listeners, we hope Ethan and Phoenix's journey has touched your hearts as deeply as it has moved us. Their story reminds us that healing often comes from unexpected places, and that sometimes, in helping others find their wings, we discover our own ability to soar. For more emotional journeys like this one, we've prepared a special playlist of equally captivating stories. Find it by clicking on the link to your left. If Ethan's path to redemption resonated with you, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore life's complexities and the remarkable connections that can form between all living beings. Join us in the comments to share how this story affected you. Perhaps you've experienced your own unexpected healing or connection that changed everything. We look forward to hearing from you and bringing you more unforgettable tales tomorrow.